There's still some people coming in, but I guess we should probably start the meeting now. I'd like to welcome everyone to this rally, Zoom rally hosted by the Stop the War Coalition. No war on Ukraine, stop NATO expansion. It comes obviously at a time of growing tensions in the region, a time when incredibly there is a serious risk of a new European war developing. My name is Chris Nynham. I'm the Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition, and I'm very, very pleased that we have tonight assembled a really excellent platform of experts and speakers who are going to put the case against war, the case for peace, the case for a diplomatic, peaceful solution to the crisis that is developing around Ukraine. And this is a case that unfortunately has not been heard very loudly or very clearly in the mainstream. So I think this is a very, very important event, and I'm very, very pleased to see that we now have 300 participants in the meeting, and I suspect we're going to have a whole lot more. We had, I think, 800 people registering, so I'm sure more are going to join. The way I'm going to run the meeting is I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one, and they'll speak each for about 6 or 7 minutes. I'm going to be quite strict on the timing because we do have 7 speakers. We welcome questions from the audience. Put them in the Q&A. The questions will just go straight through to me and to the host, and I'll try and read some of them out. I won't be able to read them all, obviously. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of pose them to the panel as we go through the list of speakers, because we're not going to have time, obviously, for a full Q&A, and I want to try and wrap the meeting up after about an hour and a quarter. So as I say, each speaker will have 6 or 7 minutes to put their case. And I'd like to start with Andrew Murray. Andrew is someone lots of people will know. He's an author, he's an activist, he was the long-term former chair of Stop the War and is a current officer of the organisation. So Andrew, over to you to start the meeting.
Well, thank you, Chris. We've got a lot of experts on our panel tonight about Ukraine and Ukrainian-Russian relations. So I wasn't really going to touch on those particularly. I was going to set out Stop the War's actual position on the possibility of conflict. However, today we've had this extraordinary attack on Stop the War by Keir Starmer. For those listening who may not be familiar with him, if you're not joining us from the UK, he's a leader of the opposition. He's supposed to be opposing the government, but he spends most of his time opposing the left, and today he's opposing Stop the War by falsifying our position on the conflict around Ukraine, pretending that we are supporting aggression when that is the exact reverse of the truth. I can only see his remarks as part of his continuing effort to make himself as acceptable as possible to the establishment. I mean, he's already changed Labour's policy from where it was under the leadership of Jeremy on one thing after another, and all in the direction of accommodating Labour to the establishment. However, he has drawn attention, I think, to one useful thing. Stop the War opposed the war in Afghanistan. It opposed the invasion of Iraq. It opposed the intervention in Libya. All of those were supported by whoever was leader of the Labour Party at the time. And on all those occasions, Stop the War was proved to be right, and the leader of the Labour Party was proved to be wrong. And I have every confidence that the same will be true today. But what he has said is a warning that he is backing the government, despite his job title being leader of the opposition, 100% in its aggressive approach to this to this question. But to be clear, Stop the War does not support any aggression against Ukraine. We never have, and we never would. We believe there has to be a settlement, a diplomatic settlement of this, that respects the right of Ukrainian people to self-determination, and at the same time recognizes legitimate security concerns that Russia and the Russian government might have. We make no apology for the fact our campaign is directed against the policy of the British government. It does not mean we endorse the policy of any other government, but we are looking at the actually quite extraordinary policy of the British government, which appears to be trying to talk up a conflict around Ukraine to the greatest extent possible. There's barely a day without the British government even going further than the US administration, warning there's going to be a war, there's going to be a provocation, there's going to be a coup in Kiev, this is the person that's going to be installed. Along with the rhetoric, arms are being sent to Ukraine, and British troops are being deployed in Eastern Europe to a greater extent even than they were before, i.e. doing all the things that are likely to be most provocative in this situation. That's the contribution of the British government, and that is what we have to challenge at a time when other European governments, the French and the Germans, are following a much more sensible policy of looking for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. I just want to make a few supplementary points, possibly. One is, it needs to be understood there is no right for any country to join NATO. Countries can ask to join NATO, but whether you join NATO or not is a matter that is determined by its existing members, which really means, in effect, the United States of America. The idea has somehow got about that if a country isn't allowed to join NATO, its fundamental rights are being violated. That is not so, and has never been so. What has been violated is the pledges given by US officials to Gorbachev and others at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, that this would not be the occasion for NATO expansion. Well, we've seen NATO expand relentlessly since. Well, so what, its protagonists say? NATO's a defensive alliance. Well, you cannot say that in the light of the war in Yugoslavia in 1999, the 20-year war in Afghanistan, the intervention in Libya, all of which were carried out under NATO auspices. And of course, the war in Iraq, while not formally a NATO war, was led by the principal NATO powers, the USA and Britain. So it's not irrational when you see NATO expanding, coupled with hostile rhetoric and the flammable situation in the Ukraine, that you would then get very concerned about what's going on. And these are the issues that need to be addressed. And the idea that there's all the good guys on one side, the bad guys on the other, is simply an oversimplification at the very best. We see what's happening with NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe and the extraordinary rhetoric from the British government as an attempt to maintain and if even extend US hegemony across Europe. The same issue is arising in other parts of the world as well. And for those who talk about Ukrainian sovereignty, where was the concern for Ukrainian sovereignty when Victoria Nuland in 2014 and again now, a senior diplomat in the State Department, was virtually dictating who Ukraine should choose as its prime minister? This was an attempt by the USA to bring Ukraine within its own orbit. We say there has to be an attempt to return to the Minsk agreements that were reached between Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany to try and bring a halt to the conflict in the Donbass. Those have not been implemented by the Ukrainian government, which is supposed to grant autonomy, measure of autonomy to the regions in the east, where many people identify very strongly with Russia or are actually Russian. That has not been done. Those agreements need to be looked at, and we need to have an architecture of security in Europe that meets everyone's needs. It isn't the implement of anyone's hegemony. So that is what Stop the War actually argues for in this case, apart from the fantasies being peddled elsewhere. We want to see the British government change its policy to stop being in the vanguard of provocation, to stop almost, it seems like, wanting a conflict to begin, if not a shooting war, at least an escalation of tension that can justify the continuing eastward expansion of NATO. We want an end to that and a return to negotiation to solve this problem. And stop the war makes no apology at all for our record on foreign policy over the last 20 years, which, as I said, is somewhat superior to the Labour parties or the Labour Party leaderships. And we believe that, again, on this dispute, those who are rattling the sabres are the ones that are actually doing a disservice to peace and stability across Europe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for starting the meeting off so well. I should have mentioned that you are actually Deputy President of Stop the War Coalition. Yes, thanks very much for that introduction. I'm now very, very pleased to welcome Christina Bucholtz to speak. Christina is a German anti-war activist. She was an MP for the Die Linke Party between 2009 and 2021, and she remained very active in the anti-war movement. Over to you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and it's very good to see you and to send a strong signal of no to war, an international sign of no to war with this meeting. So the Russian troop buildup on the Ukrainian border is not the starting point of the current escalation. The USA's ambition to expand NATO to the east was combined with the EU's hope to expand its own power of sphere. After the Cold War, NATO, whose existence has always been justified by the threat of an invasion from the east, remained in place. And since the victory in the Cold War, there has been a step-by-step redivision in Europe. NATO exploited the weakness of its Russian rival to advance eastwards into its former sphere of influence. In 1997, the NATO-Russia Basic Act was concluded. According to it, both sides strived for a mutual relation of trust in order to create a common space of security and stability. Translated, this meant Russia's recognition of the repartition of Eastern Europe. In return, NATO promised not to take any further unilateral steps that would harm Russia's geostrategic interests. This promise included the agreement that there should be no substantial deployment of troops from other NATO states or of nuclear missiles in the new Eastern European NATO countries. And in this capitalist world order, however, interstate competition cannot be permanently contained by treaties and declarations of intent. Moscow accepted the fact that the 3 Baltic states joined NATO in 2004. Open conflict arose over economic and geopolitical interests in Ukraine. However, this former Soviet republic has enormous economic potential. It's strategically important as the northern riparian state of the Black Sea. In 2013, the EU presented the Ukrainian government with an association agreement that required the cutting of economic ties to Russia. And this was bound to cause a rift in Ukraine, whose economy was closely intertwined with EU, Europe, and Russia alike. After years of military advances further and further east, the West used its economic strength to push Russian interest out of Ukraine as well. Moscow reacted militarily, annexed the Crimean Peninsula in March 2014, and has since supported secessionist efforts in the east of the country. The economic competition between East and West has turned into military competition, and a new arms race was the result. Both sides were demonstrating strength and provoking each other with a level of military activity not seen since the 1980s. And this process has been pushed by NATO on a massive scale. For example, by building up NATO Rapid Reaction Force, which can be mobilized in a very short time. In the recent years, NATO has increased its troop deployment on its eastern flank as well as its naval presence, and it holds regular maneuvers. The German government is seen as less warmongering than Johnson and Biden, but Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Joe Biden and he made clear Germany sees itself as part of the same threat set as the US, as NATO, and also Boris Johnson. And at the same moment, the government is still hesitant to send weapons to Ukraine, but the cabinet has just decided to send 350 soldiers to Lithuania as a part of the enhanced forward present battle groups. The new Defense Minister Christina Bucholtz said, quote, "We are thus strengthening our contribution to NATO's eastern flank and sending a clear signal of determination to our allies." So I think this is very clear and we have to go against this. The rulers in Germany are interested in two things. First, immediate economic interest. Part of German capital want cooperation with Russia and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The others want cooperation with the US and rely on the US fracking gas instead of Russian. And this shows that imperialism, the system of competition between capitalist states, has always involved struggles over essential resources. Not only from an ideological point of view, the struggle against fossil capitalism and for radical climate change or against radical climate change is a crucial struggle we have to unite on internationally. On the other hand, it's a central interest of German capital to increase its political and military weight. And this is why there has been a massive rearmament over the last 30 years. German soldiers have been sent to Afghanistan, to Mali, and to the Eastern Europe NATO states. Germany's military budget has been increased by more than 50% between 2014 and today. And the red, green, yellow government now even wants to break the taboo and wants to buy killer drones. The EU is no alternative either. The EU is not a peace power. All the large EU states are NATO members. EU states have military bases outside Europe, are waging wars outside Europe, are currently arming Ukraine, and much more. And we know about the geopolitical rivalry in which the USA interests in minds and not the good of humanity. The majority of people do not want war, not in Western Europe, not in Russia, and not in Ukraine. We want to reach and mobilize these people. Following Karl Liebknecht, we say the main enemy is in our own camp. No war over Ukraine, no arms deliveries, no more NATO soldier, and no eastward expansion of NATO. We demand to end the foreign deployment of the German army, the Bundeswehr, and we say no to the militarization of the EU. Thank you very much. And yeah, let's try to increase our efforts to stop this escalation, to stop this war. And I think we can win internationally.
Thanks very much, Christina. Great to have you on the platform and very inspirational. We're going to go next to Diane Abbott, MP. Diane, unfortunately, couldn't actually be present live, but she very kindly agreed to do a video and send a message of support for the meeting. She's the MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, has been since 1987, I believe. And also she's been a very, very strong supporter of Stop the War from the start and a very strong voice for peace in Parliament. So we will now go over to Diane Abbott and listen to her message. Oh, maybe we won't. Here we go.
Grace, you need to switch the sound on. Is it?
Can we go back to the beginning? Sorry about that.
Sorry, is it because I was muted that it won't, that it's not playing through there?
Yeah.
Oh, because, okay, sorry.
we see that the United States has decided that it needs to send US and other NATO troops to Russia's borders. This alone should tell us that the claims that Russia is the aggressor should be treated skeptically. The destabilization in the entire region comes from a continued eastward expansion of NATO. We need to find peaceful solutions to our complicated conflict of identities and national rights. This was done elsewhere in Eastern Europe as countries peacefully separated, but the approach of the British government and others is in the opposite direction. The United States has only just ended one disastrous, prolonged war in Afghanistan, and many here seem to be gung-ho about starting another one. The public is opposed to war with Russia, which would be extremely dangerous for all sides, not least the people of Ukraine. NATO is a nuclear power, and so is Russia. We need de-escalation and dialogue, not militarization and threats of war.
That's great from Diane. And we'll now move on, hopefully, to Nina Ptaska. We're very, very pleased to have Nina here. She's the Ukraine coordinator for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It's great to have a Ukrainian voice on this call. I just want, before you start, Nina, I just want to read out a couple of questions that have come through. One is, what is your view on Ukraine's right to move towards Europe's orbit? And the other is, what is the mood on the ground in Ukraine? What is the sense of the dangers and the risks ahead? So over to you, Nina.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation and speech. And of course, if I start from the ground and about the fears and worries about the economical situation, about the escalation, because last couple of months everybody waiting for something, and we are hoping that we pass in this period with a less of threats. But of course, in this situation, nobody knows and how it can be solved. And in the same time, there is a massive interact and threats to peace and security response represented, but current like a corner over the both territories. And this escalation not start now or couple of months ago, because before I heard the one of speakers mentioned that it starts from the NATO or not from the NATO or from Russia. It starts from the both sides. And of course, after we have this conflict last 8 years, and since this time, Ukraine lost Crimea and the territories, non-government controlled territories, regular received weapons from Russia, and of course, NATO playing a visible role in the Ukraine. And we have two positions, and we are trying to go through two of these, like between two stones. And Ukraine has, from the one hand, Ukraine has sovereign and the right to claim membership in any unit, but in the other side, other hand, Another position, the Western resolution do not want to accept Ukraine military involvement against Russia, and should promising NATO refuse to have Ukraine in this membership. And this is, we only see the interest of those who make money on this war, and including they even providing loans to buy this weapon from Britain, from America, from even from France, and from all countries who want to participate in this conflict. And of course, this conflict not between Ukrainians. This is conflict between Russian and America and NATO, and with the hand of Ukrainians. And Ukraine here like a battlefield. And this is very sad for me. As if we talk about peace talks, we do not see any interest to continue Minsk, even from Russia's side. And the critical case of success of this representative participation for people who are really suffer from the conflict. So I mean the lack of people from Ukrainian side, and people who are really want to live in peace. And now it's looked that all these peace agreement doing without Ukrainians' will, and without but conflict also continue with Ukrainians' hand. So we call, and I call personally to Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin and everybody who earn from this conflict, have the to give the opportunity to speak from the side of the Donbass, and I mean the side from Ukrainians. And it's very necessary for everyone include people who are ready to this dialogue, people from grassroots, people from NGO who are spent a lot of years to build this trust and dialogue. And of course, this security, this is mean security, because because human security, and we forgot about this we fled this territory of Ukraine with many kind of weapon, and forgot what means security. And security means first of all the political participation. It's safe of many reasons. It's economical safety, and political, psychological, and environmental. So we need to be for peace with full of package of this security. And which also important to stress that maybe the best way to solve this conflict, to decrease this conflict from America to Russia into Ukraine level, and to guarantee to make the space for free will election, and for guarantee for freedom of speech, and the guarantee for security for people who are standing for peace, for human rights, and for sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nina. Fantastic to have you participating tonight. That was excellent. I'd now like to ask Richard Sakwa to say a few words. Richard is an author. He's written many books on Russia, Eastern and Central Europe. He's also the professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. Before I ask you to speak, I'm just going to throw a couple more questions in, if that's all right, Richard, which, you know, you can take or leave. Maybe someone else can pick them up. First of all, how serious and how deep are the splits within the NATO alliance that are emerging? Second, what do you think the US and the UK are ultimately want to achieve with their policy over Russia? So those are two questions for you. Over to you, Richard.
Lovely, thanks very much. I'm going to make 4 points, try to keep things fairly concise. And the first one you may think is a slightly left field, but it's going to refer to the joint statement of China and Russia on the 4th of February. Putin was in Beijing for the opening of the Winter Olympics. And this joint statement is perhaps one of the most important documents of our time. It puts into context all that we've been talking about. It puts in shade, for example, the fact that Europe is once again on the certainly involved in a deep conflict and possibly in violent conflict. This joint statement, the full title of it, Joint Statement of Russia and China about a new area in global sustainable development. And it really does outline their positions. I've been arguing for a long time that both Russia and China need to put forwards a positive vision of what sort of world they want to see. And this is finally the document that is out there. It really is a fundamental moment, and I think as important as the Bandung declaration of the non-aligned movement way back in the mid-1950s. And I can't go into any detail now. I certainly do stress everybody to have a look at it. It's about basically that a multiplicity of civilizations, different types of modernity, and above all, an absolutely resounding commitment to what I call the Charter International System as established after the Second World War, after 1945, based on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the Charter, and all the subsequent legislation and the body of international law. Unfortunately, this foundational Charter International System has been usurped, and this is effectively what the two leaders are saying, usurped by what Keir Starmer in his astonishing statement today talks about the rules-based order, which effectively is a subsystem within a suborder within the international system, which claims certain rights and privileges within international politics, but thereby undermines the fundamental principles of equality of states and of international law. So that's just a few words to stress just how important, what a game changer that document and that statement is, and it affects what we're talking about, Ukraine and so on. And that's my second point. How did we get to where we are today? And the way I see it nowadays is that after the end of the First Cold War in 1989, there were two peace orders on offer. One of them was the Gorbachevian type of transformation, which would have put an end to the old bloc alliances, which is condemned, by the way, in the joint statement, arguing that alliances like NATO are archaic and, in fact, promote conflict and division rather than transcend them. At the end of the Cold War, we have Gorbachev and Yeltsin talking about the need to transform European international politics to establish all sorts of things, including a common European home, a type of Gaullist vision of a pan-European security order all the way from Shannon to Vladivostok, and a lot of other elements. However, this was absolutely explicitly challenged by George H.W. Bush and his successors, who said no. And it was they explicitly said, we can't allow Moscow or Russia to have the initiative, and by implication, Gaullists, and by implication, our friends in Germany, the Ostpolitikers, those who believe through transformation, through engagement, all that long tradition was explicitly repudiated at the end of the Cold War. And so instead of this transformation, we got into the logic of expansion, including of expansion of NATO. NATO expansion on its own wouldn't have been so bad if it was within the framework of an indivisible security order, which was outlined in all those fundamental statements, which is that, if you like, that first model of post-Cold War order, which is the one based on Helsinki, then the Paris Charter for New Europe in 1990, the Istanbul Declaration of 1999, the Astana Declaration of 2010, which the Western leaders constantly refer to and Ukrainians refer to today, but only half of it. Half of it is about the sovereign right of nations to choose their security, but every single document says it has to be indivisible. This is repeated in that joint declaration of Russia and China, which also says that the security of one state cannot be at the expense of another. And quite obviously it has been. Expansionist logic was always an expansion without Russia. Putin tried to deal with that when he first came to power. If some of you will recall his interview with David Frost in the year 2000, when David Frost asked Putin, can Russia join NATO? And Putin said, "I почему нет?" And why not? But of course, we all know why not. There can only be one tiger on the mountain, as our Chinese friends put it. So this rules-based order is a usurpation of the international system, the 1945 Charter international system, and it puts, of course, Washington, London in the driving seat. And it's astonishing that Keir Starmer should have repeated what is ultimately quite clearly, and anybody who's done any homework will understand, a challenge to the international system. So that was my second point. My third one, briefly, is the context is, of course, that on the 17th of December last year, Russia put forward its European Security Treaty, which was going back to this earlier positions and arguing we do need to transform. These documents have been largely knocked or repudiated without even examining the substance. The European Security Treaty goes back to the idea which Medvedev had in 2008, his speech in Berlin in June that year, and then the treaty in November 2009. At that stage, the West refused to engage in discussion about how to establish an indivisible security order. In fact, it was mocked, just as these ideas of Putin's in December 2021 have also been mocked. But look at the documents. They're absolutely sensible. They're absolutely normal. Limits to NATO enlargement, no placement of missiles which could threaten others. In other words, back to the intermediate nuclear forces. And a whole stack of other things. But the response of the West, certainly NATO, has been shocking. Jens Stoltenberg is clearly not just a shadow of previous NATO general secretaries. I have in mind Lord George Robertson and others who understood the Russian position, if not agreed with it. The US has kept the door open for negotiation and diplomacy. I think that's important, but clearly hasn't really engaged with some of the substantive Russian concerns. The UK, of course, position has been how can I put it, completely negative. It has been adding fuel to the flames. As we know, the Germans have not given permission for the overflights of the arms to Ukraine. It's not a question of Ukraine defending itself. It's a question of how we can fit Ukraine into the larger European security order, which is absent. And until we solve that larger question, Ukraine will be divided, and specifically and deliberately divided. That was, of course, the Brzezinski line way back. Russia and Ukraine must not come together. And they did everything to poison that relationship for 30 years. And so this is all coming to a head. Finally, fourth and final point, how do we get out from the impasse? Well, I personally am very, very pessimistic. I don't think there'll be an invasion. That was never on the cards. The Russian forces there are basically a rather muscular way of trying to get to the negotiating table. In 2018, Putin said, look, you didn't listen to us then, listen to us now, when he announced all his hypersonic missiles and so on. He also said that in a Munich Security Conference in 2007 about NATO enlargement. It's been 30 years when Russian leaders have been making these points. And so maybe this muscular diplomacy, just like Khrushchev, in the Cuban Missile Crisis was trying to get Soviet concerns about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, invasion of Cuba, on the agenda.
Can you start to wind up now, Richard, please?
Okay, so 4 very brief points. How do we get out of it? A limit to military operations on the NATO-Russia border, a moratorium, not a ban, but a limit on Ukrainian membership of NATO. It's not going to join for the next 2 or 3 decades anyway, so let's make it formal and official. The third one, dealing with through some sort of Helsinki II process with the other frozen conflicts, Crimea, Transnistria, possibly Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and even possibly Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And finally, the modernization of the 1975 Helsinki Accords to genuinely make it inclusive and indivisible. There is a way out of this, a peaceful way out of it, but I'm afraid that too many Western leaders simply are not willing to engage in the dialogue and diplomacy that is required. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm now going to move on to Medea Benjamin. Medea is a well-known figure on the international anti-war scene, but she's co-founder of the US peace group Code Pink. And I'm just going to read out one question before you start, which is, isn't there a parallel with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US said it wouldn't permit Russia to put missiles in Cuba, and leaders Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed after negotiations to withdraw the missiles from Turkey and Cuba? Job done. Over to you, Medea.
Yes, it's wonderful to be with you, and let's hope that there are cooler heads that can prevail, just like happened at the missile crisis. But the situation we're in the US right now is one of talking tough, one of sending more troops to the region, more warplanes, more warships. At the same time, we see the polls that have come out that show that the American people over a broad spectrum, not depending on their ideology, are against going to war, even if Russia invades Ukraine. The latest poll I saw was done by the Koch brothers, a right-wing organization, and they came out and said Ukraine holds no importance for US security and the American people are against going to war. But still we have the tough talk coming from Biden, and in the Congress, we have a very difficult situation because the Republicans are criticizing Biden for not being tough enough. And those few Republicans who say, well, why are we focusing on Russia, really instead want the US to focus its wrath on China. So that's not very helpful. On the Democratic side, if it were a Republican in the White House, we would have several, well, almost the entire Democratic members of Congress along with us, or at least certainly those in the Progressive Caucus, which is the largest caucus in Congress that has about 100 members. But instead, they are afraid to come out against a Democratic president, and they have spent the last 10 years demonizing Putin and blaming him and Russia for Trump having won against Hillary Clinton instead of recognizing what a bad candidate Hillary Clinton was. And so the Democrats are really afraid of being labeled as pro-Putin. So there are a few exceptions in the Congress. Bernie Sanders just had a piece out in The Guardian, I think today, certainly very strong on anti-Putin, but calling for diplomacy. But we have had a hard time getting our natural allies in Congress to speak out against what's happening. Instead, what they're doing is vying with each other over who can have the most aggressive piece of legislation in Congress. The Republicans said, let's give Ukraine another $450 million in, quote, lethal aid. And the Democrats came back and said, no, that's not good enough. Let's give them $500 million. They also are calling for sanctions that the Democratic leader of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate calls the mother of all sanctions, which I, as a mother and grandmother, take offense at because we're supposed to be nurturing, not inflicting pain. But they're talking about these sanctions as being everything on the energy sector to the financial sector, not letting Russia use the SWIFT system, which would be potentially devastating. And they also want the sanctions to be not imposed if Russia indeed invades Ukraine, but says that it could be for anything that interferes with the sovereignty of Ukraine. And so that leaves it wide open to the US being involved in economic warfare for something as potentially minor as cyber attacks of Ukraine. And Nancy Pelosi, who is the leader of the House Democrats, comes from the most anti-war district in the country in San Francisco, wants to fast track that legislation so it can be done very quickly. We just put out a memo to Congress saying diplomacy for Ukraine is spelled M-I-N-S-K. We don't hear any of them talking about the Minsk agreement as the framework for a solution to the problem right now. We are glad to hear that Macron came out yesterday and said both Russia and Ukraine are amenable to going back to the Minsk agreement, which is a very positive development. On the other hand, in the US, the rush to war is certainly something, as Nina said, that benefits a small sector of the economy, like the weapons industry. In fact, just the other day, the CEO Raytheon told an analyst that I fully believe we're going to see some benefit from this increased tension. This is a time for us to educate people about the dangerous alliance that is NATO. Most people in the United States don't know what NATO is, and now they're learning about it. I see that as the silver lining in this is that we have a chance to teach the American people that NATO is indeed a dangerous military alliance. And I would love to have a joint campaign with Stop the War Coalition and other peace groups in the NATO countries to say that we are fully against this goal of NATO of spending 2% of our GDP on the military, that we can see much better needs for the spending of our money. And finally, I just want to say that we are working very hard to organize in the United States against going to war. On 48 hours notice, we had over 75 demonstrations around the United States last Saturday, and we have more coming up this weekend. We look forward to working together with the Stop the War Coalition, the No to NATO campaign, and others to get off of this unhelpful binary of Russia bad, US NATO good, and instead get on to the real one that says war is bad and diplomacy is good. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Medea. Brilliant to have you here. We now move on to our last speaker, who is Jeremy Corbyn MP for Islington North, and former chair of the Stop the War Coalition and a massive supporter of the organisation from the start. And before you start, Jeremy, I don't know if you're ready to start. You don't look like you're totally ready to start. But I'll just read out another couple of questions, if that's all right, that you can take or leave. The first is, the British and the Western media is so fear-mongering, it's no wonder public opinion thinks Russian invasion is imminent. Is public opinion changing? How can we raise awareness of what's actually happening? Secondly, would guaranteeing neutrality for Ukraine reduce tensions in the region? So there's two questions for you. Over to you, Jeremy. You're muted, Jeremy. Jeremy, you're muted. You need to unmute.
I've unmuted now, Chris. Chris, could I start by just sending a message from John McDonnell, or have you got it and can read it later?
If you send it to, it's up to you, whichever. I mean,
I've sent it to you. I've sent it to your phone. So
okay, I'll read
you've got it.
Why don't you start and I'll read
Okay.
it later. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, Chris, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all the other people that have spoken and spoken so well and in such an informed way. I wish that all debates about Ukraine in our national media were so well informed, because there is a distinct lack of balance in any discussion about this in our media. There's an assumption that the solution to all problems is to go to war. That I find very depressing. There have been some very how should I put it, unfair remarks made today about the Stop the War Coalition. Let's just get the record straight. Stop the War Coalition was founded in 2001 after the attack on the World Trade Center. We condemned the attack on the World Trade Center, but we said an invasion of Afghanistan and the occupation of Afghanistan is not the solution. And 20 years later, British troops have finally left Afghanistan with all the thousands dead and the terrible plight of the hunger of the people of Afghanistan at the present time. That was a war that was goaded into by the world's media and by the idea that the only solution to a problem is to send the troops in and bomb. I think people should just think a little bit before they say anything about that. And then later, our opposition to the Iraq war, we were similarly condemned as being pro-Saddam Hussein. I just have to say on the record, I was one of a very, very small number of members of parliament. You could count them on the fingers of one hand, who opposed British arms sales to Iraq in the 1980s because we were not supporters of that regime. By not supporting a regime, it doesn't mean you want to go to war with them. It means you want to bring about peace for the people of that area and those people. And so this event this evening is to ask people to think a bit more carefully about the situation facing us at the present time, and obviously facing the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia. We have an atmosphere of daily film of tanks and troops on one side of the border in Russia, and demonstrating that there's a huge Russian military presence there on the border. We then have other film of described as lethal weapons being shipped into the Ukraine, and huge demonstrations of military hardware in Ukraine, all building up on both sides. It is incredibly dangerous. And it's the US with British support that is leading the way on this. And it is the European countries, particularly France and Germany, who are urging some caution, and indeed the ones that are trying to promote diplomatic approach to this and some serious talks between Ukraine and Russia. And whilst Liz Truss is today in Moscow, and I have to say, I think it's a good thing she's gone to Moscow. I hope she's gone there with the intention of trying to bring about a diplomatic solution to all this, but I don't know. I think the proposals put forward by Macron and others are more likely to bring about some solution to all this. And then there is the question of the previous agreements that have been made. In 1991, at the end of the Soviet Union, there was a declaration of independence of the Ukraine, which was overwhelmingly carried through the Ukrainian then communist authorities to be independent, and Ukraine was recognized by Russia as it was by many, many other countries. And later there was, after the issues about Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine, the Minsk agreement was reached. The Minsk agreement was a basis, as Richard was pointing out earlier, which could have prevented a further military conflict coming along. And so I just think we need to send out a very strong message that there has to be a diplomatic solution to this issue. There has to be peace, and there has to be an accommodation of the people's needs within Ukraine, as well as a non-aggression by anybody. So surely that has to be a good basis on which we go forward. Because I just ask you to think through where this leads to now. With all this massive military hardware on both sides of the border, something could go wrong. A mistake. A plane accidentally overflies. Somebody shoots that plane down. There's then a retaliation. There's then another retaliation. There's then another retaliation. You can see where all this goes to. This is an incredibly dangerous moment. And so we don't need blanket approval for war from various countries around the world. What we need is a recognition that all conflicts have to be resolved politically in the end. So why don't we get on with a political solution to the conflict at this very moment? And so the build-up of NATO forces in Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO. There are people in Ukraine that would like to join NATO. There are people in Ukraine that would not like to join NATO. That's a decision that will be made at some point in the future. Personally, I think the build-up of a military presence on the borders of NATO to Russia is something that will only encourage the development and increasing of troops' presence on the other side of the border. And so what we're saying tonight is simply this. The British government, which Andrew Murray was quite correct to point out, is the issue that we have. We are the Stop the War coalition. We are here in Britain, and we have criticisms to make of the British government. Boris Johnson, who probably for his own political reasons, to get out of all the other problems he's got, headed off to the Ukraine and has made increasingly bellicose statements about the need for and preparedness for armed conflict in the Ukraine, and keeps on thinking he's in some kind of historic moment. He does tend to model himself on Winston Churchill rather too often for comfort. They are simply backing the idea there is only a military solution to this issue. Well, there isn't. There has to be a peaceful solution. And I think it is the job of all of us to speak out for peace, to speak out for dialogue, to speak out for a diplomatic solution to this conflict, and to cease the buildup of forces. Now, under successive questioning over the last few weeks, the British position, the British government's position, seems to have changed somewhat. We started off with Ben Wallace telling us there was no British military involvement in the Ukraine, but we were a supplier of weaponry. We were then told there were British troops there to ensure the weaponry was properly installed, and that there were then an increase in the number of British troops that were there for training. We're now told that there are troops ready to support any action that happens in Ukraine. So we've had, without the start of any hard conflict, hopefully never, but yet, a mission creep of the British involvement in this. Make no mistake about it. If a conflict takes place, I suspect the British government will be sending British troops there. Goodness knows for how long, goodness knows what the consequences of that conflict will be. There will be tens of thousands of people on both sides of the border killed. There will be a destruction of infrastructure, a destruction of towns, of cities. There will be a most horrible and frightening war. And both sides have access to nuclear weapons. Ukraine does not itself possess nuclear weapons, and indeed, to its credit, renounced the holding of nuclear weapons on independence. But obviously, NATO has access to nuclear weapons, as does Russia. And so I also suggested to Liz Truss that in her visit to Moscow, she should also say that Britain was prepared to engage with Russia through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and through the Global Ban Treaty Conference, which will be held this summer in Vienna, where we would be, if we joined in it, joining in with 159 other nations around the world that have sought to end the use and legality of nuclear weapons. Britain, unfortunately, is not one of those. So Can't we turn this issue round? Instead of the tension leading to the danger of a war, turn this round and say this is a moment for peace. It's a moment for diplomacy. It's a moment for understanding. It's a moment for recognizing the human rights needs of people on all sides of this, and turn it into a wider movement towards peace. And I'll finish with this, Chris. The COVID crisis has shown us just how vulnerable this world is, just how vulnerable this world is to the consequences of inequality. And real security doesn't come from war, doesn't come from conflict. Real security comes from healthcare, education, housing, work, the ability of young people to be able to live their lives in peace. That is why we founded the Stop the War Coalition. That is why we've been around for much longer than ever thought we'd need to be around. But the tensions now on the borders of Russia and Ukraine show how right we were to found the Stop the War Coalition, and how important it is to have that coalition of people wanting peace, not war, and looking for solutions, not war and guns and all the deaths and killing that go with that. Thank you very much, everyone, for being on this call tonight. And thank you to Stop the War Coalition for all the work that's been done over the past 20 years.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Thanks for summarising the risks, and also pointing out once again why it's so important that we continue to organise in the UK. I'm going to quickly ask Andrew.
Can you read John's message?
Yeah.
Or shall I read it?
1 second, actually. Well, do you want to read it now? Because it hasn't come through. So if you want to...
Oh, sorry.
Then I'm going to ask Andrew to say a few words at the end.
Yeah, John McDonnell is doing a meeting in Swansea tonight, and sent a message which he's asked me to read out, and it's here on my phone. He says, I'm in Swansea tonight for an SCG rally. Can you pass on a message of solidarity from me to the Stop the War meeting tonight? Say from me, and I quote, "This is a time for calm discourse, not saber rattling. It's time for diplomacy, not aggression. It's a time to talk, not threaten. It's a time for solidarity across peoples, not politicians maneuvering. That's what Stop the War stands for, and that's why it has my support. Solidarity, John McDonnell MP."
Thanks very much to both of you, Jeremy. Thank you, John. So I'm now just going to ask Andrew Murray to say a few words, to come back on a couple of the questions and say a few words to end the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, I think this meeting, the speakers we've had and the attendance we've had, is in a way one of the best answers to the critics of Stop the War and the position that we're taking. It's particularly welcome. We've got Christine, Nina, and Medea with us from other countries, because this is an international movement. It has to be an international movement. And I'd say to Medea, I think without doubt, Stop the War will be very interested in uniting with Code Pink and other brothers and sisters in the USA in the sort of campaign she was outlining. And it's also great to have Richard with us. I mean, his book, I don't think he mentioned it, Frontline Ukraine. Anyway, it's the best book I've read on the subject, and it's still very, very relevant to the situation that we're in. Now, I mean, Jeremy, with I think his characteristic generosity, said he hoped that Liz Truss had gone to Moscow in the interests of diplomacy. I would love to believe that too. However, it was said that all she did was issue propaganda slogans at the Russian foreign minister, and may even have, according to one account, when Lavrov asked her, well, do you at least accept the sovereignty of Russia over Rostov and Voronezh? She said, we will never accept that, before the British ambassador pointed out that those were actually cities deep in the interior of the Russian Federation. Perhaps she's been made foreign minister to make Boris Johnson's own undistinguished record in that office for a couple of years look good in hindsight. But I'm not optimistic, because the whole British government position has been about confrontation and aggravation. And that is why I find Keir Starmer's position so strange. It's been quite open to him to say the British government should be behaving more like Macron, more like the German government, even with all the weaknesses in its position, which Christine drew our attention to. So there is another course, but instead he is doubling down on rhetoric about Ernie Bevin and the foundation of NATO, and taking the hardest line possible behind a government that is taking the worst line of any of the major powers involved in this campaign. So I think Stop the War's position has been made clear. We are not about denying the rights of the Ukrainian people to self-determination. We are, of course, that has to be, as Richard has outlined, there has to be a recognition of the divisions of opinions within Ukraine as to how that is exercised. Many of the problems now stem from the 2014 events and the way the regime there was changed, and the way that Russian sympathetic opinion, one could say, has been marginalized. But that's a matter that has to be resolved internally, diplomatically, just as these international dimension has to be resolved through diplomacy and discussion as well. So I'd certainly urge anyone at this meeting who's not a member of Stop the War and who doesn't agree with Keir Starmer to join Stop the War to help build our campaign, because they may not like hearing it, but you will be joining a movement that has been proved right on every single conflict of the 21st century, at a time when the political elite was in unity in being wrong. And that will happen again today if they insist on making this a macho confrontation test about extending NATO and US hegemony up to the borders of Russia. So with that, Chris, I'd just like to urge everyone to continue their support for Stop the War, and to thank you all for joining the meeting this evening.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks to all our speakers. Fantastic panel. Great to have such a strong international panel. Also great that we had more than 400 people coming along to this event. Please do follow Andrew's advice and join Stop the War. Maybe set up a meeting locally to put the arguments. This is a case that we're in a big minority over, but it's a case we can win. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night.